In democracies, unfortunately, government agencies like the Federal Reserve or the Bureau of Labor Statistics and so forth, they will not tell people the truth. I mean, if you look at the US economy as an example, statistically it is still growing. But assuming that the inflation, and by inflation I mean the cost of living increases, exceed what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculate. At the present time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics says the cost of living of people are going up by 2.7% per annum. But let's assume they go up by 5% or 10%, as some private economists suggest. My estimate is somewhere that your cost of living goes up between 5 and 7% or more. Now, assuming that these figures the government is using are not correct, then we're not talking about economic growth, but actually a contraction in real terms, inflation adjusted. In other words, if you look at 70% of US households, they're struggling. But the Fed's policy with money printing has lifted the standards of living and the wealth of the 1% of the population massively, because housing prices are going up and stock prices are going up. So all these people, they are much wealthier than before, including myself. I don't borrow money, I have deposits. For me, it's Christmas time each time interest rates go up. But for poor people who have mortgages outstanding or consumer credit, each time interest rates go up, it's a disaster. So the Fed's policy have actually, as they always have done in the past, they have favored Wall Street and the rich people at the cost of the middle class and the lower classes, the lower income recipients. So that is the state of the economy, and not just in the US, it's worldwide the same. You can go to Germany or England, ordinary people, they're all struggling. Well, I think that in Europe, people are waking up to the fact that the governments committed economic suicide with policies that make business so much more difficult, that essentially restrict freedom. And so people are fed up and have a move to the right. And this has also happened in Argentina, by the way. I think you can go this far until people realize these policies are destructive for us, and then they will wake up and vote politicians that are more in the center or on the right side of the spectrum. It's more positive that there are less regulations and less laws that restrict business activities. Say the Greens, the environmentalists, in some context, they may have the right idea. But you understand, once it becomes a left-wing ideology and it makes doing business impossible or more expensive, or leads, like in Germany, to a country that once before was admired by the whole world as a miracle, an economic miracle, and now it's impoverished because of the poor policies that the Green government and the socialists implemented. Once this happens, there is a turn and people wake up and say, okay, we have to change. But it may be too late. Then the damage has been caused already, and to come out of this mess is not as simple as Mr. Trump believes. The idea that he's got to reform and to clean up the deep state is a good idea. And he had this idea already in 2016, I may add. Then he became president, and what did he do? Nothing! He appointed to his cabinet deep state people, and now, if you look at the people that he's surrounding himself with, are these poor people? No. They're all billionaires. Do you think they want the stock market to go down? No. They will print money like there is no tomorrow, because they all depend in their wealth on asset prices going up. In the US, I don't hear about the indices, Nasdaq and S&P, which are driven by the Magnificent Seven stocks and by the FANG and FANG-related stocks and semiconductors. In other words, a narrow group of stocks is driving the index up. That index, in my view, is topping out and will go down from here. The broad market, there are stocks that are depressed. Let's look at oil stocks. Oil stocks are relatively deep value stocks at the present time. They're less than 5% of the S&P 500. So this is a sector I would look at. When you look at foreign markets, I talked about Europe briefly. In Europe, the potential for an improvement is huge because it's been so bad for so long. So the valuations are reasonable. They're not ultra cheap like in 2009 or in 2003 or in the early 80s. But they're reasonably valued, especially relative to the US. They've been underperforming the US for the last 10 years. Similarly, you cannot find any analyst and you cannot find the media that is positive about China and Hong Kong. And because everything is negative about China, they also drag down the other Asian markets, especially Indo-Chinese markets. So there is some value there in my view. And Latin American markets are also relatively depressed. I think other countries will say, well, if this Milei succeeded and stocks go up and enrich people of Argentina, then it's good that we do the same here in Colombia and in Brazil and in Peru and in Chile. So I think these markets have a large upside potential. People look at NVIDIA. By the way, NVIDIA and Tesla are the largest holding of individual investors in America. Two companies that are extremely highly valued and whose future is highly uncertain. When I grew up, I remembered very well what the price level was in Switzerland. And when I go back to Switzerland now, I can compare the prices that exist now with the prices that existed in the 50s and 60s. And then I look at the price of gold. The price of gold until 1971 was at $35 an ounce. And now it is around close to 2,700. So in my book, actually, gold has kept its purchasing power. The price of bread is not up as much as the price of a gold of ounce, but the price of insurance premiums is up maybe more. I think that people should own some precious metals. I like now platinum. I think platinum is relatively depressed, and in a bull market for precious metals, it can go up. But what I wanted to say about gold, I don't think that gold is that cheap. But then I look at the whole financial system. You see, when I started to work on Wall Street, the market capitalization of the US was just 25% of GDP. Now it is close to 200. And the whole bond market in America was less than $1 trillion. It was around $900 billion. And now you know how big it is. Can we determine whether gold is expensive or cheap? According to some statistic, I could say that gold is not expensive. According to others, I can say it's expensive. But I can do the same for, say, I look at the price of soybeans, wheat, corn, sugar, and so forth. Is it expensive or cheap? It's more expensive than before, but it's still depressed, relatively speaking, compared to other prices that went up much more. The problem of monetary inflation is that it distorts everything. Everything becomes very murky. It's very difficult to say, is my house expensive or cheap because of monetary inflation? And then there is also the fiscal aspect. Suddenly the government, in its ultimate wisdom, and we see its wisdom, how they handled the fires in Los Angeles. This is now a good example of government's competence. It's a complete disaster what they've done. Anyway, what I want to say is, in monetary inflationary times, when the government issues more and more money, it becomes very difficult to determine I'm wealthier or poorer, because everybody soon will be a billionaire. It will be a billion like in Zimbabwe. When I went to school, and my father was a very successful orthopedic surgeon, he always says, oh, my client is a millionaire. $1 million was in the 50s a lot of money. Nowadays, who gives a millionaire? Even $1 billion is not that much anymore. Let's take GDP growth of, say, 3%, and then we measure by how much has the government debt increased. If the government debt increases more than the 3%, then you could argue it's all been essentially financed by the government, this growth. And is this sustainable? Now, the modern monetary theory economists, they will say debts don't matter. Well, in the US, they began to matter now because interest expenditures every year are over $1 trillion. And they're not going to come down for the foreseeable future. So you end up in a situation where the government or the Fed will have to print money so that they can pay the interest on the debt. And then you are in a death spiral, hyperinflation. And that is what every government, every society has done in history. To tell people, you know, you have to tighten your belts, we have to cut your pensions, is politically in a democracy not acceptable. I wrote a report, why in democracies we'll always have more inflation. The other option is you go to people and say, look, we've been spending too much and we've been living over our standards of living. So what we have to do is to increase taxation. They do it to some extent already on homes. To maintain a house is becoming more expensive in the US because the insurance premiums are going up. And in some areas, like in Los Angeles now, the insurance companies stopped insuring against fire because they were afraid that the government is so incompetent. A lot of people lost their homes without an insurance. I don't insure my homes either. But you know, in life we have to get used to the fact that one day we go somewhere else and we have nothing at all. The government should stay out of the economy. It should build roads and infrastructure and provide security in the state, because most families, they want to walk through the street without fearing that someone will knock them over, or even worse. Security is a prime consideration. Why do so many people move to Hong Kong and to Singapore especially? Because in Singapore, I used to stay in the house of my friend. He had the cars on the parking lot in the garden. The gate was open and the car keys were all in the cars and the door to the house open. I have an office here in Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand. I don't even know whether I have a key. My doors are always open. Many Americans, they come here. Many other people from the world, they come here, they say they feel safer walking on the street of Chiang Mai than in Berlin, Munich, Zurich, London, Paris. Many people have to realize that an important aspect of one's life is that you trust your fellow men and women. Because capitalism, to a large extent, is built on morals and on trust. Say, you and I, we make a business deal. Yes, we can have 100 lawyers drafting the contract and so forth. But if one of us is dishonest, the lawyers are not very helpful. And the moral aspect of society is very important. And in my view, the government intentionally has created chaos among citizens, because it's easier to control people once you have chaos.